I'm going to build myself a new computer, and I'm going to put it into this case right here. This is like this newfangled, I don't know, fancy schmancy case. And is it fancy schmancy or is it artsy fartsy? Now wait a minute, hold on. This is artsy fartsy. That, fancy schmancy. So stick around, I'm going to build a computer, stuff it in here, and then I'll give you my impressions on this case. I am one of those fortunate enough to live close to a Microcenter, just a few short miles away.
You lucky bastard!
So I just got back from Nerds R Us, and here's some of the goods I'm going to be using for this build. For the CPU, an AMD Ryzen 5 3600. Not super high-end, but also not a total budget CPU either. The motherboard is an MSI with the AMD B450 chipset. And it's got the Wi-Fi. I had to search specifically for one with Wi-Fi because for some reason this is still not standard on motherboards. I don't know why. And this is a micro-ATX form factor, which is the biggest that'll fit in this case. And like the CPU, not top of the line, but this will do everything I need it to do. I'm not building a gaming rig, and I'm also not going to overclock this thing to the moon trying to squeeze out every bit of performance I can. And the memory is a 16 gig set of G.Skill 2400 DDR4. I'm going to do the old build the entire computer outside the case on top of the box that the motherboard came in. That way I can fire the whole thing up, boot it, make sure everything's working correctly before I install anything into the case. Then that way if I have to troubleshoot something or if something's not working correctly, I don't have to yank it back out again. Now keep in mind, this is not a video on how to build a computer. I guess I could do that, but there's already plenty of videos out there on YouTube on how to do that. I'm just showing some sped up footage of my assembly while I yak for a little while. That being said though, I'm more than happy to answer questions you might have about building a computer, so if you do have any questions, go ahead and ask away in the comments. One of the drawbacks to building a computer outside the case like this though is even though you can hook up pretty much all the components, normally you can't hook up the front panel connections and therefore no power switch. And so no way to turn the computer on. So you just have to jumper the power switch connector on the front panel header on the motherboard. Not a huge big deal, but you have to know where to find it. It appears that everything is alive and working, so now I can tear this thing down and then install it into this newfangled case. You get the top cover off by removing these two thumb screws here, which is nice that it's toolless. And that cover, the middle of it is a mesh, and on the sides it's a clear, well, it's not clear, it's a smoked acrylic. And under that, what appears to be a radiator mount. Now, I'm not using liquid cooling, so I'm going to take this mount out, at least to get it out of the way for now while I'm doing the assembly. And then I'm thinking I'm probably going to have to put it back in, not because I'm using it for a radiator, but it's going to add to the structural integrity of the case. And that was my suspicion. And as soon as I pulled that thing off, I realized the back of that case sprung back a little bit. So now I know for sure I'm going to have to put it back in. Otherwise, that top cover is probably not going to seat properly the way it's supposed to when I put it back on. And I'm just taking this thing apart some more. The bottom covers, judging by the pictures, I'm going to need to get access underneath there because that's where the drives go and the power supply goes. So I'm sure that's what the instructions would be telling me to do had I actually read them. I'm putting the power supply in with the fan facing down. This case does have venting in the bottom specifically for the PSU cooling intake. And the power supply is a carryover from my old rig. It's a 550 watt unit, still plenty of power to run the new setup. Putting the motherboard in now, and already in place were 6 standoffs, motherboard standoffs. Your standard micro-atx motherboard has 8 mounting locations. So I looked at the hardware package that came with the case and there was 1 extra standoff in there. And I thought that was weird. So I looked at the instructions, of which there weren't many for that case. And it says included with the case was standoffs times 7. So you're short a standoff. Now if you've built a computer or two, you probably have some extra ones lying around. But if not, you're going to be short one of these standoffs. Routing all the cables now to hook up the motherboard, including the front panel connector. And there's plenty of options as far as your cable management goes, which is nice. You can pretty much keep everything hidden. Once those side panels go on the bottom, it's going to hide most of your power supply and cables and so forth. And then on top, minimal wiring showing that you can see through that acrylic panel. Okay, up and running now. Everything's installed, and before I button this thing up and put the covers back on, we'll take a closer look inside. Looking at the left side here, of course, down on the bottom is the PSU, and there's plenty of room in front of it for unused cabling or excess cable. Even if you had a longer power supply, there's still room for the cable. There are 2 drawers here for hard disk drives. Of course, you can install solid state drives as well, up to 4 if you were to use those double drive mount adapters, or even go with a combination. Another carryover from my old rig is the graphics card. It's an older Radeon HD 4850, physically not a very large card, but if I ever decide to upgrade to something newer, that is if the GPU shortage ever ends, you can see that there's plenty of room for even the longest graphics card in here. The case itself only comes with 1 fan, and that's the big 200mm fan in the front. There is a mounting location in the rear for a 120mm fan, so I added one there. Additional airflow is usually never a bad thing. I'm going to spin this around to show the other side, and speaking of spinning this around, when all the covers are off, which will need to be when you're building this, these 2 screw heads will be exposed, and that's what the rear of the case will be resting on. So if you try to slide this around, and you'll be doing a lot of that during the assembly, these screws are going to gouge whatever this case is resting on. I found that out firsthand, so it's a good thing that this desk already looks like crap anyway. I would recommend, until you get the covers back on, and thus the feet, cover these maybe with some tape, or in my case, this foam pad that came as part of the packaging with the AMD CPU. I placed this under those screw heads, and they sink in just enough to where when you slide this thing around, it'll move with the case. So, spinning this around and not gouging up my desktop, taking a look at the other side, and ignore that hard drive there, temporary, just transferring some files to my new build. Of course, when I'm done with that, I'll just disconnect everything, take those wires, stuff them back underneath there. Actually, I'm going to disconnect this right now because I can just see me rolling this case over to show the bottom or something, forgetting that that drive is sitting precariously on top, because that's totally something I would do. Speaking of drives, there is an optional mounting location for an SSD here, as well as on the other side. But, like the other side, I don't think the placement of the mounting holes is ideal. Using those mounting holes puts the SSD too far back, and there's no room for the cables to come straight up from underneath through that pass-through and connect to the drive. So, I drilled 2 alternate mounting holes a little further forward. That leaves the pass-through clear to run the SATA power and data cables from the drive straight down through. Before buying this case, I read some reviews and saw more than a few comments that stated that the front fan is not RGB, but only white, and the button on the side that's supposed to change the color mode doesn't do anything. I found out how that could happen. This fan is powered by a Molex connector, and what came plugged into the fan Molex was this, what looks to be like a coupler, but doesn't look like it actually does anything except connect 2 Molex connectors that would connect anyway. However, if you delete this and plug the fan directly into the PSU Molex, the RGB doesn't work. It's only a white light and the modes won't change. I don't know what's in here, whether it's a shunt or a power delete or a bridge or whatever, but it does need to be in line in the Molex in order for that RGB to work. The biggest issue I can see with, or potential issue with this case, is notice I've got a dual slot video card here, and this is in the top slot on the motherboard. But notice that it takes up the second and third spots in the rear access here. See, here's the blank and the 2 spots for the video card. My other expansion slot is here, and notice if I were to put something in there, there's no access in the rear for that card. So if I were to put something in, I'd need to customize that and cut part of the rear of the case away there. It could just be this motherboard too, possibly other ones have the expansion slots up higher in the next position, in which case no big deal. It's not a big deal for me. I'm not planning on adding anything anyway, but I could definitely see it being an issue for someone that needs more than one card and is using a motherboard with this same layout. All together now with the panels back on, because there's no components on the inside that are lighted and that top panel is tinted, you really can't see through it much at all. But I just so happen to have some of these cold cathode tubes sitting around for about 5 years, thinking I could eventually use them for something. Now, this radiator mount actually serves a purpose for my build anyway, as well as that rear access for an expansion card that will never actually exist in this location, which is where the on-off switch mount goes. The blue tubes put out just enough light to give a muted view of what's inside, but not too bright to where it's distracting. This case has a novel design, and it's nice to have something different than the standard tower. I built computers in a lot of cases, and this may be one of the easiest to work with when wiring up the motherboard because everything is so open and easy to access. It would be nice if it had a bay for an optical drive, although not sure where it would go in this design, but I do understand that's something that's becoming increasingly rare, and there are methods for getting older software on CD or DVDs installed anyway. I don't think I've ever had the perfect case that fits all of my needs exactly, but just about any shortcoming usually has a workaround. As a bonus, the price is very reasonable. I got this one from Amazon. If you're interested, I'll put a link in the description. It really is a neat little case. Big fan.